Well, welcome to the Constitutional and Legislative Affairs Committee meeting of Monday, 30th of April 2018. We have a full attendance, so there are no apologies. Are there any declarations of interest? As there are none, then I'll just go through the handling, housekeeping arrangements. In the event of a fire alarm, members should leave the room by the marked fire exits and follow instructions from the ushers and staff. There is no test forecast for today. All mobile devices should be switched to silent mode. The National Assembly for Wales operates with both the medium of Welsh and English languages. Headphones are provided through which instantaneous translation may be received. For any that are hard of hearing, these may also be used to amplify sound. Do not touch any of the buttons on the microphones, as this can disable the system, and ensure that the red light is showing before speaking. Interpretation is available on Channel 1 and verbatim on Channel 2. So we move on to item 2 then. Instruments that raise no reporting issues under Standing Order 21.2 or 21.3. We move on to the Safeguarding Board's General Wales Amendment Regulations 2018. Any comments from, so no comments on that. Any comments from members? Okay, so we note those. Item 3, instruments that raise issues to be reported to the Assembly under Standing Order 21.2 or 21.3. We have the composite negative resolution instruments, and you have before you the regulations, the transposition note, explanatory memorandum and report. These regulations are part of a package of measures to transpose Council Directive 2013/59, Euratom, laying down basic safety standards for protection against the dangers arising from exposure to ionising radiation. Refer now to the Assembly lawyers for any comments.
Only to note these have been made by the Secretary of State and the Welsh Ministers, so they lay before the UK Parliament and the Assembly, and they're in English only.
Okay, any comments? There's none.
That's just our usual issue with the English only in these circumstances.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Well, plus, and in the event of Brexit, what happens? Because this is Euratom, isn't it?
Sorry, what?
In the event of Brexit, after we leave Europe, Euratom?
I'm not sure what the latest is on Euratom, I'm afraid.
Right, okay.
Well, we're implementing the directive now in any event. And it would become part of retained law, of course. Item 4, papers to note. Scrutiny of regulations made under the EU withdrawal bill. You've got paper 6, letter from the First Minister dated 25th of April. Letter from the Llywydd, 25th of April 2018, letter from the Minister to the External Affairs and Additional Legislation Committee of 25th of April 2018. Correspondence really to be noted. Are there any comments on the correspondence?
Well, I think it's for us to determine urgency and, control the process. I think it would just allow them to use it as a vague criterion whenever they needed, or felt the need to do it, just in case, and that's not really a very satisfactory system. I mean, it's not really their best episode, I don't think, in terms of lying low and then shouting loud as soon as they've, the Assembly has spoken.
I agree entirely, and we've made a point as forcibly as we can, and I think the Llywydd is taking that forward, and no doubt we will have correspondence in due course that will inform us of what the outcome of those representations have been made. We now move on to item 4.2, letter UK Government understanding of devolution. I think members are invited to note that the letter has been sent to Chloe Smith, MP, the Parliamentary Secretary, Minister for the Constitution. The letter was an action from the UK Government's post-Brexit report, so that letter really to be noted. Item 5, motion understanding order 17.42 to resolve to meet in private. Everyone, is that moved?
Agreed.
And agreed? And we will, of course, be back in public session at 3:30 to take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance on the Brexit issues. We now move into private session. This is a reconvened session of the Constitutional Legislative Affairs Committee. I'd like to welcome the Cabinet Secretary for Finance to further give evidence in respect of the withdrawal bill and the memorandums that have been agreed between the Welsh Government and the UK Government. We'd like to introduce your officials.
Thank you, Chair. So again this afternoon I'm joined by Simon Brindle and Owen Davis.
Well, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We've got quite a lot of questions to put to you. I understand you've had a busy day today with one of the other committees as well. So we'll get moving on those. When you were last with us, of course, you outlined that there were a number of, you were getting close to agreement, that there were another number of discussions that had been taking place, and that you're getting close to a compromise agreement. In respect of the compromise, I wonder if you could just outline briefly what it is you sought to obtain in the ideal world, and what it is that has not been achieved in the negotiations.
Well, Chair, if you don't mind me using the language of the freezer, which we got used to in this bill, I'll try and explain that what the negotiations have been about since the UK Government published its inverted Clause 11 amendment were these four things. The inverted Clause 11 amendment, as you know, reversed the original proposition in which nothing was to be retained at the devolved level, and everything was to be retained at the UK level, other than things to be passed back to us, and created the position in which everything was to remain at the devolved level, other than those things we agreed would be held for a temporary period at the UK level. We then had a number of issues that we needed to resolve. If matters were to be held at the UK level, how was the decision on what was to be retained to be made? If things were to be held at the UK level, who was to have access to the freezer, who would be able to use powers while they were held there? How were matters to be released from the freezer? And how long was all this to go on for? How temporary was temporary? And we believe that we have secured agreements on all those four matters sufficient to allow us to put a legislative consent motion to the floor of the Assembly and to recommend that it be supported. Because now things that are to be held at the UK level will require the consent of the National Assembly for Wales. While matters are held in the freezer, neither devolved ministers nor ministers acting on behalf of England will now be able to make use of those powers. How are things to be released from the freezer? Well, by a process in which all devolved governments and the UK government act together to agree frameworks which will govern those matters in the future. And now we have a sunset clause which puts a firm backstop end point to the length of time that these powers can be temporarily deployed in that way. Those are the four questions we started off with. We think we have satisfactory answers to them all. Hence, we are prepared to come to the Assembly with a recommendation that legislative consent be given.
I think that you yourself said that the outcome is not perfect, but that there is sufficient protection. Sufficient seems quite a low bar when it comes to protecting the Welsh constitutional settlement. Why don't you perhaps elaborate on what you mean by sufficient, and to what extent this is really an agreement that's dependent on trust, or will there be sufficient guarantees in the legislation itself?
Chair, I don't want to get into a semantic discussion, but I don't regard sufficient as a low bar. I think when the good Lord said in the Sermon on the Mount, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, he was saying to himself, well, I'm sitting a pretty low bar there. I think the word sufficient is to be taken in its normal and natural meaning, in that it is enough. It is enough for us to be able to come to the floor of the Assembly. And I think it is enough in all the aspects that I have outlined. Are there things that, had we had more time and had things been capable of being done in a different way? Well, I'm sure there are. I'll give you one example. When the powers are held in the freezer, Welsh ministers and Scottish ministers and ministers in a Northern Ireland executive are not able to make use of those powers, and that will be in the statute. English ministers will not be able to act on them either, and that is set out in the intergovernmental agreement. So we come to the same place, but by different routes. Ideally, would it have been good to have had us all covered in the legislation? Well, I probably think so. But in the time available and with negotiations going up to the very last minute, we have, I believe, secured parity of treatment, but not by an identical means. The end is the same, the means are different. It would have been preferable, on the whole, to have had both of them the same, but I don't think that it in any way amounts to a barrier to the agreement being approved.
And just one further question from me before I move on to the other members. You do say in your letter, the 24th of April, to David Liddington, that you would have preferred arrangements to have been developed without the need for legislative constraints, with respective governments trusting each other's undertakings not to legislate in areas where we agree UK-wide frameworks are needed until they've been agreed. Trust still is a significant element of this memorandum and its workability.
Well, Chair, as we said from the very beginning to the UK government that Clause 11 was unnecessary, that we should have all of us come through the door with our separate responsibilities, committed to reaching an agreement on a way forward, developing frameworks that we could all have played a part in developing, and that would have been an entirely trust-based solution, and the Welsh Government would certainly have been willing to play its part in that. In the end, the UK Government believed that it needed that trust to be underpinned by something in the bill. And I believe that the discussion that we have had on frameworks and indeed on the intergovernmental agreement demonstrates the validity of our position, that it is possible by detailed discussion and negotiation to reach an agreement that doesn't require legislative routes, but trust has to be built up, really. Trust doesn't just arrive on a single day. It depends on everybody working hard to develop it and then to nurture it. And I think we've made a good start in the way that this agreement has been drawn up on that process.
Okay, thank you. Lloyd.
Yeah, just a brief trot through several questions, really. Referring to your statement in Siambr last Wednesday, you said at one point that without an agreement with ourselves, as regards the, Clause 11 amendments, without an agreement with ourselves, the UK government would simply revert to the original amendment. Is the implication of that, on what you told us, that the UK government would have bypassed legislative consent if it was refused by the Assembly?
Well, first of all, Chair, thank you for the question, of course, because I think it pinpoints an important part of this debate. Our belief as a government was that the choice we faced was between securing what we had negotiated painfully over many weeks with other colleagues, or something less satisfactory, not a choice between what we had negotiated and something better than we had negotiated. I don't think it is right to construct an argument that says, had the UK government simply put down its original Clause 11 amendment, that would necessarily have led to the outcome that Dr. Lloyd suggested. Because had they done that, the game would not have been over. We would certainly have laid amendments to that amendment in the House of Lords. We would have acted, I'm sure, with our Scottish colleagues in trying to do that, and we would have gone on trying to persuade the Lords that they should have supported our amendments, which would have been an advance on the original Clause 11 amendments, which would have built on many of the points that were made by members of the House of Lords during the earlier stages in the House of Lords debate, and we would still have aimed to have got to a point where the amendment that was finally passed in the House of Lords was one that we could have come to the floor of the Assembly to seek consent. So I don't think it leads in that sort of linear way that the question suggests, because there would have been many other steps still to fight out in the process.
Indeed, and all that's accepted. But given, as you said, that in your statement last week, that the current situation, having accepted this now, is not perfect, it could be viewed that the UK stance in the negotiations saying that, well, if you're not going to agree, we'll simply revert without any sort of amendment in between. We'll just revert to what was there before. You can forget about flipping the Clause 11 amendments and whatever. We'll simply revert. That can also be construed as some sort of vague sort of threat, if you like. And given the Secretary of State for Wales, Mr Alan Keynes, had said that even if this Assembly would reject legislative consent, that the UK government would respect that decision. So how, given that backdrop, how would you have considered that the UK government's stance of saying, right, okay, if you're not going to agree to this, you're simply going to have what we suggested first of all, but you knew that the Secretary of State had said we'd respect the decision of the Assembly, or wasn't that the case?
Well, first of all, Chair, I should make it clear that the UK government never, in an unsubtle way, said in the negotiations, if you don't agree with this, then we'll be reverting to our last offer. Negotiations don't take place in quite that sort of direct way. It's a judgment. It's a judgment that we had to make, and it's a risk-based judgment, isn't it? If we did not take the agreement that was on the table and which we thought had made very significant steps forward on what was available before, we thought the risk was there too significantly that we would lose all of those gains and the UK government would revert, not to the original Clause 11, I never myself believed they would do that, but to the inverted clause that they had originally put down. I may be misunderstanding the question, so apologies if I am. But if the question was to say, if the Assembly then denied legislative consent to that proposition, we would somehow be in a better position. I just don't really see how we would be.
Just to explain, the question was,
yeah, thank you.
Secretary of State had said that they would acknowledge and respect the decision of this place to refuse legislative consent if it came to that. So why did you feel an overwhelming need to agree with them? Because surely there was no threat then if the Secretary of State said they would accept our vote if we rejected the legislative consent.
Well, I suppose it is for the Secretary of State himself to elaborate on what he meant by that. It still would be my judgment now that we are in a better position, having reached an agreement that defends devolution, and I think it entrenches a number of defences to devolution, not just in this bill, but in the process that will follow, than in declining to come to an agreement, coming to the floor of the Assembly without an agreement. Yes, the Secretary of State may have respected that decision, but I think we would be in a worse position as a result of that course of action than we are as a result of the one that we have pursued.
That's forgetting all about the continuity bill argument, but I'll move on to stick to the script, Chair, because we haven't got all day, as you remind me. Sunset clause. I mean, initially, First Minister had said, been quite scathing about the concept of sunset clauses in terms of we wouldn't accept a sunset clause, he said on the 27th of November. Who is to say that it wouldn't be extended ad infinitum in the future? It's a matter of principle here. That was 27th of November. Obviously, you would say there's a lot of negotiation has gone on since then, but that sounded like a bit of a fundamental principle. So why has the Welsh Government now accepted a sunset clause, and what guarantees have you received that that clause won't be extended ad infinitum by the current UK Government or future ones? Because, as you pointed out, we're going into deep freeze mode now for several years, so that rather paralyses the workings of the next Assembly Government as well.
I think there are three different points there, Chair, because the Lloyd threw in a final point there, which is quite a big point, actually, so I will say something on it, if you don't mind. First of all, the First Minister, when he was making his remarks back in November on a sunset clause, was referring to Clause 11 as originally drafted, because at that point, no powers were resting in the Assembly. Everything was being taken back to Westminster, and the First Minister said that a simple sunset clause, based on the fact that no powers were coming here, would not be sufficient to assuage our anxieties about Clause 11. Now we have a very different Clause 11, an inverted Clause 11 in the first place, and now a Clause 11 with all the additional amendments that secure the consent of this legislature, guarantee that English ministers cannot use those powers, make sure that when those powers are released, it is on the basis of negotiated, agreed frameworks in which all parties come to the table on parity of esteem, and then a sunset clause on top of all of that. And that is a very different context than the one that the First Minister was commenting in back in November. As far as this business about the extension of a sunset clause, I think I need to be clear that the amendments that are laid do not make provision to allow the sunset clause to be extended. It is a fixed period with no power to extend. The only way in which the period could be extended would be through fresh primary legislation, and that fresh legislation would be subject to all the normal Sewell conventions that any primary legislation requires. In other words, it would have to secure the consent of the National Assembly for Wales. So there is no arbitrary way in which the UK government by itself, without the involvement of this legislature, could extend the sunset period. The bill and the amendments simply do not allow for that to happen.
So no powers additional to what Parliament already has by virtue of its status as a sovereign Parliament?
The identical position that we enjoy today, Chair.
Well, just in terms of the deep freeze, I mean, in terms of, it's going to be 8 years' time. If there's a year till, we leave, and there's 2 years, and then there's 5 years on top of that, so that's where the 8 years comes from. In terms of 24 areas, perhaps more, will be in a deep freeze somewhere. So that rather traps the next Assembly government into this sort of whole escapade as well, or do you foresee a rush to legislate once we hit March 2026, or not?
If I could, I want to make 2 points, and then Simon will add some further ones. I think the fundamental point to remind members of here is that what happens when any area is in the deep freeze, it simply guarantees that the current status quo continues. And that status quo has been the status quo for successive Assembly governments since 1999, because the status quo is the European Union rulebook, and that rulebook has applied to each Assembly that has been elected ever since devolution was inaugurated. And all this does is to guarantee that the rulebook that we operate on today will continue with nobody able unilaterally to interfere with it until we all agree on the frameworks that would be necessary so that the UK can operate in the post-Brexit world. So our hands are no more tied here than they have been since 1999. Now, how quickly will the powers that are being held centrally be released back to the devolved administrations? I argued last week on the floor of the Assembly that I believe it will happen a good deal more quickly than the backstop period suggests.
Why you say that?
Yeah, I say for this reason, that until we were able to negotiate that English ministers are in the identical position to us, there was a risk. There was a risk that actions might have been able to have been taken on those policy areas in relation to England, while we were unable to operate in relation to Wales. Now we are in exactly the same position, and that means the pressure is equally upon all partners to come to an agreement on the way in which these powers can be released into the hands of English ministers to pursue policies they will wish to pursue, and into the hands of the National Assembly of Wales so that we can use them here. And because we are all in that same position, I think the pressure will be on everybody to come to that agreement as soon as we are able to do so. The agreement now requires that the Secretary of State will lay every quarter a report in front of Parliament, which will be sent to the Assembly as well, to explain the actions that have been taken to make sure that that process is being taken forward expeditiously. So I think the pressure will be on everybody to try and come to these agreed frameworks in a timely fashion. We will certainly have the 2 years of the transition period, provided that is agreed, where we're all bound. There'll be no ability for any of us to implement new frameworks. And I think that we will use that period purposefully. I think the work that has been done already on the deep dives demonstrates how much ground we can gain when we all get around the table to do that. The 5-year period beyond those 2 years is a backstop. It is the last possible moment at which powers will be released back into the hands of the National Assembly, and I believe, for the reasons I've outlined, that it will be done more quickly.
Okay,
Just
I'll give you one
slight
more
point of, in terms of, obviously, the way that devolved parliaments deal now with the deep freeze situation is statutory through the restrictions in legislation. Yet, when it comes to England-only legislation, that is defined under the intergovernmental agreement, which is not statutory, surely. That's a political agreement. So there is a differentiation between England-only legislation in devolved matters in the absence of an English Parliament, and obviously that's an argument outside my mandate as a Black Committee Assembly member, but the fact is it's not an equivalent field. That's what I'm trying to drive at,
yes, well,
and we need protection from that.
Well, look, Chair, I completely accept that point that Dr Lloyd is making. We reach the same end by different means. That's the point. That's my reply. We are all bound. We are bound by the statute. They are bound by the intergovernmental agreement. It is a fair point for Dr Lloyd to make that those are not necessarily of the same weight. And I said in answer to an earlier question that had we had more time and were ideally able to do it, I'd have preferred that we were all in the same position. But I do want to say to the committee, as I said on the floor of the Assembly, that if anybody thinks that getting that clause in the intergovernmental agreement that binds the hands of English ministers was done in any way casually, or just put in there without people having had to be argued to get to that point, and that it wasn't absolutely seriously made as a commitment, they would be mistaken. That commitment from the UK government was hard won and hard fought for, and I know that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, with whom we were negotiating, had to go and work hard with his colleagues to get their agreement to that being in the intergovernmental agreement. So I think we are entitled, in the trust-based way that you said, that if a government commits itself in that serious way, they intend to honour that commitment seriously.
Is it a constitutional first for UK government to bind itself in that way?
Well, Parliament cannot bind itself, and that was one of the arguments that was used against a statutory solution in relation to English ministers. But I at least know of no other example where we have an intergovernmental agreement of this sort.
Okay. Mandy Jones.
So, staying on the intergovernmental agreement, did you request that the content of that was written into the bill?
Well, I think that the content of it is written into the bill. I think the core parts of the IGA are reflected in the amendments that were laid by the UK government last week. But the IGA does go beyond the statute as well in some of the things we've just been talking about. Had there been more time, I think there were aspects of the sort I've just described which we might ideally have liked to have pushed into the amendments. But we got as far as we possibly could. And I think the amendments faithfully reflect the agreements that we have reached and which the intergovernmental agreement sets out.
Fantastic. Why did the Welsh Government accept the statement in the agreement that the implementation of this agreement will result in the UK Parliament not normally being asked to approve Clause 11 regulations without the consent of the devolved legislatures?
Well, Chair, we accepted that because it is just a straightforward restatement of the current constitutional position. I did notice last week on the floor of the Assembly that there were some members who were regarding the not normally clause as though it was something novel and new in this agreement. It's there in the Government of Wales Act. The founding statute of this Assembly contains a clause in Part 4 that says it is recognised that the Parliament of the United Kingdom will not normally legislate with regard to devolved matters without the consent of the Assembly. So, not normally is just part of the founding DNA of the relationship that this Assembly has with the UK Parliament, and we picked up that phrase and replicated it in relation to the additional safeguards that the intergovernmental agreement sets out. And, Chair, you know, I think we've learned something in the years since then. There have been over 100 occasions in which the Assembly has been asked to consider legislative consent to a UK bill. And there are examples, not many, I know, but there are examples where the UK government says up front that it needs our agreement, and we haven't given our agreement, when the UK government has then withdrawn the clauses from the bill to which consent was not given. So the police reform bill, to give you an example, the police reform bill required that local authorities should establish a panel to oversee police and crime commissioners. The National Assembly did not give its consent to that, and that clause was withdrawn from the bill as far as Wales is concerned. So, you know, we will no doubt sometime in the future reach a place where is not normal. And so, you know, the rule, but so far what we have established is that consent is asked for, and if it's not given, the UK government does not go ahead with the things to which consent has been denied.
Are there any further questions? Okay, we'll then move on to David Melvin.
Yeah, Cabinet Secretary, the intergovernmental agreement, you know, appears to rely on trust and respect and culture, and you know, so it uses kinds of phrases like that, looking for you know, either common frameworks, for instance, and not normally, and I think unreasonably withheld, these sorts of things. And, you know, I think the position of this committee has been, and clearly seen most explicitly in our report on UK governance post-Brexit, that, you know, we need more institutional rigour now. And I just wonder where we are in that respect. Do you think we've advanced at all to a firmer, clearer, more constitutional, if I can use that word, position?
Well, Chair, I completely agree with the point that David Melding is making, and that was made in this committee's report and was set out in the Welsh Government's own paper, Brexit and Devolution. The other side of the European Union, we will need more rigorous, constitutionally entrenched means of conducting relations between the four constituent parts of the United Kingdom. We've been able to rely on our common membership of the European Union up until now for so many of these things. We're all bound. The UK government, as much as we have been bound by the rule book that the European Union has created. When that is taken away, and we are developing frameworks of our own to be agreed between the four parts of the United Kingdom, we will need better machinery than we have today. Now, I think I said to you last week that the last 6 months or so of the JMCEN have been a more constructive experience than previously, and I think that gives you some confidence that these better ways of working can be developed. I think that what we have set out in the intergovernmental agreement in relation to frameworks is a small but important step on the journey towards the sorts of arrangements that this committee has set out, because it's now nailed down in that agreement that frameworks will be produced not by the UK government suddenly producing something late in the process, sending it around everybody else and saying, you know, you've got a short period to comment on it, and then, you know, sort of take it or leave it approach to things. But we will all be equally involved from the outset. And by the time a framework emerges, and hopefully by the time it makes its way for the consent of the National Assembly, it will be genuinely on that shared, trust-based, jointly produced basis. But we've got that commitment in relation to frameworks. Now we need that, exactly that spirit to be applied to the way we do business more generally between us. The JMC is not a sufficient vehicle for that. We need something much more like we have argued, a Council of Ministers on the European model, on a much smaller scale, of course, just the 4 UK nations. And we put some proposals in there on qualified majority voting, for example, to guarantee that no one part of the United Kingdom could constantly frustrate the agreed position of everybody else in coming to joint positions on matters of mutual interest. So I think what we have here is an example, albeit in miniature, of how those bigger relations should be conducted. It therefore takes us an important step on that journey, but there is still a considerable way to go.
And David Liddington, in his letter to you, is very polite and urbane, as anyone who's met him would say. That reflects his personality. But there's not much that's concrete there. Just say, the successful collaboration indicates that, we can look at these issues and for longer-term reform and all that. And you've talked very much about future frameworks and that they won't just be plonked on you, please sign off unless you want to kick up an awful fuss, but will be, jointly work to construct. But, I just wonder what you've seen so far that gives you confidence that these are now going to be taken forward. And will they extend to the governance of frameworks? This seems incredibly sketchy to me. It's almost as if once you've agreed a framework, it's there as a perfectly existing entity that never requires any further adaptation or whatever. But, the real detail could well be in how they're applied, not in, they could be quite broad and, setting out, quite wide policy aspirations or whatever, or regulations to, govern certain standards. And then the detail will really be very, very important. So, why do you think that the UK government are now going to give this a priority which they've not really shown in the past?
Well, Jim, my answer to that, I think, would be it's because they are now being advised, and very regularly advised by their own civil servants, of the need for those governance arrangements. Because what the framework deep dives have thrown up, and they've thrown it up absolutely consistently across them all, are exactly those sort of questions. Say we can reach an agreement on a framework. What happens to it after that? What happens if one of the parties to the framework believes in 3 months' time that something that they hadn't originally anticipated has come up? What if one of the parties believes that one of the other parties is not adhering to the framework? What if a new set of circumstances arise that means that the framework needs to be revisited in some way? We have to have a book of rules that says how those concerns can be raised, who has the ability to put papers on the table to have those addressed, what would the independent adjudication mechanism be if there was a dispute over an interpretation dispute over the framework. Now, we've been saying these things from the beginning, and I said on the floor of the Assembly, we weren't making much headway with any other partner round the table. The reason I think that the UK government has come to recognise the need for it is that their own people coming to those deep dives are going back and saying to UK ministers, we think we can reach an agreement on a framework. We've made some good progress and we can see where it's needed. But if we're all to have confidence in that framework in the future, agreeing it is part of the process and not the end of it. And as a result, there is more of an appetite, I believe, amongst UK ministers to engage in the discussions that will be needed to create the governance arrangements of the future. And there have now been deep dives on the governance issue itself. So, which wasn't on the original list, but it's emerged with such clarity from the deep dives on subject matters that it's now had, discussions more than a day. Am I right? More than.
We spent 3 days all together working on the governance matters. I think one of the factors that is making this issue crystallise across other governments is that in each of these areas there are specific positions to be taken between administrations and taken to legislatures for common agreements within a framework. So, who sets the fishing quotas for the UK when it's not done in Brussels? The regulatory standards for organ donations need to be set and monitored and adapted between administration. It doesn't change devolution, but it means the intergovernmental relations have a step change. Rather than staying in touch, it's about actually jointly taking decisions on matters, and that is what is driving the pressure for increasing and enhancing the governance arrangements across these areas.
And this is what in the Memorandum of Understanding on the frameworks is referred to as a broader review of intergovernmental relations, is it?
And that, Chair, was agreed at the JMC plenary between the Prime Minister and the two First Ministers, and the first meeting between officials to discharge that commission will be in May. So the work is not well underway, but it's about to start, so we know it's going to be getting on with it now.
You satisfied there is the urgency on it, because the phrasing is quite weak. It's sort of, well, we're going to have a look at it. We know we need to do something, and of course that was in line with the evidence that the Secretary of State for Wales, Ellen Cairns, gave that these things could be looked at. But it didn't seem that there was at the UK government level an understanding of the urgency, because effectively everything that's been agreed for it to be successful requires those new structures to actually be in place. Otherwise, the temptation is then to resort back to overriding agreements.
Well, Chair, we will definitely press the case for getting on and building the governance that will be necessary for the future. I've said, maybe in this committee, even in the past, that what I feel we have been up against, if that is the right way to put it, is a UK government whose hands are so full in dealing with everything else they have to deal with in Brexit, that it has been difficult to grab some attention for this with everything else that they are trying to deal with. And a Scottish government that has a perfectly proper but different constitutional ambition. The SNP government believes that Scotland would be better off outside the United Kingdom, and it comes to the table. Absolutely, I'm not in any way critical of that. That is absolutely their right to have that as their political ambition. But it's sometimes difficult then to get them to focus a great deal on how can we make the UK work better in the future, when their real ambition is not to be part of the United Kingdom.
And of course, at the same time, is that the presiding officer is engaging with the other speakers with regard to a potential speakers conference to try and move this forward. So, presumably, there's a strong parliamentary pressure across the various parliaments to resolve this.
and there is the work that this committee and the EWL committee has done with committees, parliamentary committees in the other legislatures. You know, I think pressure from all sides. Really, you have seen it in the reports of the House of Lords Brexit Committee, in the report of the committee chaired by Hilary Benn. All those reports make this same point, as do academic reports. The Institute of Government report that came out 2 weeks ago makes exactly the same points about the need for stronger institutional, constitutionally entrenched, as David Melding said, arrangements for the future. So the pressure is on from a wide variety of sides. It's getting people to find scarce resources in terms of attention and energy to focus on it.
Okay. Should we move on to Lloyd?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Well, it's a balancing act, isn't it, between those people who want to strengthen the union and others who would see that as weakening devolution. But anyway, that's a debate for another day. In terms of the Clause 11 regulations and amendments, are you content now, as a Welsh Government, have you signed off the UK Government's amendments, or is there more work due? And the second point is, how does the bill apply the Sewell Convention to Clause 11 regulations? Or, I mean, Sewell is meant to be a statute, is it? Or is it just another political convention?
Well, Chair, we saw the amendments in draft. We raised a number of technical points about them. They were resolved. The changes were made, which meant that they were in a position to our satisfaction. Might there be further amendment again? I believe that David Lidington has not ruled out further possible amendments at the third reading in the House of Lords. It's not impossible that cross-bench peers, for example, might put down further amendments before next week. And as I said in the Assembly, we will continue to work on a three-way government basis on any ideas that could produce further refinements to the amendment as it currently rests. And if there's more ground that could be gained, that ground would apply to us all. I'm very keen to emphasise that. This is not a matter of having agreed one thing for Wales, and if further changes happen, that they will only apply to Scotland. We've got that agreement with both other governments. Any ground that is gained applies to us all. And if there is further ground to be gained, on wherever the suggestions come from, we're in the room, you know, doing our best to secure that agreement. As far as Sewell is concerned, what the big breakthrough, I believe, in the agreement is that Sewell will now apply to regulations. That was not simply to primary legislation, as it always has in the past. Now, when regulations come forward, the consent of the Assembly will be sought. Sewell is a political convention. That's what the Miller case.
Is that not the case already, though, under our standing orders? Consent is required in respect of secondary legislation.
Well, my understanding is that if we had not got the agreement, then the regulations that fall from Clause 11 would not have made their way to the floor of the Assembly and would not have required the Assembly to give its consent. If anybody wants to correct me on that here now, I'll be grateful for that. But that's my understanding. Owen, well, if you don't, one moment.
Yeah, I think the distinction is that potentially here is that in relation to statute instruments, the SICM provisions in standing orders relate to amending primary legislation.
Yes.
But not specifically in relation to regulations that are meant to change our competence. And I think that's perhaps the distinction.
Okay, no, thank you for that. No,
we weren't sure whether that's.
I wasn't clear from the document whether that's what was actually meant. Sorry for.
Well, I think David's going to take care of consent.
Yes, sorry, Dave.
I might come in.
Parliament will not normally receive regulations from the UK government that have not had the consent of the Assembly. But that means that you've, that can be turned around and say, to say that you have accepted there are circumstances in which regulations can be laid before Parliament without getting consent. So why have you accepted that quite dramatic principle given your original position?
Well, Chair, that is just the identical dramatic principle that applies to Sewell in relation to primary legislation, and tracks back to the debate we had earlier. The Assembly could deny consent, but given the not normally clause in the Government of Wales Act, Parliament could still decide to go ahead even without our consent. So this is no different. This is the identical formula in relation to the regulations as applies in relation to primary legislation, other than the fact that we have secured some additional safeguards here, which don't exist in in the primary legislative field, because here, if the National Assembly for Wales were to deny consent, then ministers at the UK level must seek, if they wished still to go ahead, and it's no guarantee that they would do, they might decide without consent they would find a different way of addressing the same issue. But let's assume for a moment, in the way Dave Milding said, the consent will be denied and a UK minister decides to go ahead. They would have to seek an affirmative resolution in both houses of Parliament, as well as their own account of why consent had not been forthcoming. We would have the independent ability to make sure that legislatures had our account of that position in front of them as well. And I don't think we should assume for a single moment that the UK government is guaranteed that its point of view would prevail. Certainly not in the House of Lords. And given that there is now a level playing field in which members of the House of Lords would see the point of view of UK ministers, see the point of view of devolved ministers, and be able to make a judgment between them, and we would certainly be in there, pressing our case, as we have on the withdrawal bill, very successfully in the House of Lords. We would be in there making our case there too, and I don't think we should for a moment just assume that UK ministers would automatically get their position to prevail.
And I accept that the right to lay information and the reviewing chamber is a check in Parliament. That's not insignificant. But play a lot of store by not normally. Now, to a layperson, a warm day in November is not normal, and a cold day in July is not normal. So, how are you using normally in this regard?
Well, in exactly the same way, Chair, as it is set out in the Government of Wales Act itself. So there's no difference to the form. We pick up the formula that is there in our own founding statute, and then we reapply it in the circumstances of this bill. And as I say, we've now got, quite a significant track record of how not normally actually works out. And so far, but in the way I said to Mandy Jones, the time may come when things are different, but so far the record is either that the Assembly's consent is sought and is given, and where it was sought and not given, then the UK government has not gone ahead with its original proposals. So I think normally, is built up there through custom and practice to be, quite a significant position. Things have to be pretty unlike how they have been in every instance up until now.
So we're talking war, pestilence, famine, not an ordinary process of government.
Not an ordinary, and of course, let's not forget the UK. So the UK government might argue that Brexit is not a normal set of circumstances.
Yeah, well, taking on board what you're saying, in terms of the actual consent decision, say by the National Assembly for Wales, and I've taken the background, but obviously it is also defined, well, at the moment on the face of whatever the latest draft of this bill is. So a consent decision is defined in three ways. A decision to agree a motion. So when we agree, that's obvious consent. But Part B is a decision when we don't agree, that's taken as consent. And C, if we have a motion here, now, if that's usual custom and practice, that's fine, okay? And, you know, I understand the various ramifications and stuff. But if it's now something vaguely new, which potentially is going to appear on the face of a bill, why say it if it's not new then? That's my point.
Chair, I just don't accept that interpretation of what we have. And I've seen some of the things that have been written around this issue. What the amendment does is to set out a consent decision. And it says a consent decision can be a decision to give consent, a decision to withhold consent, or a decision not to lay a motion seeking consent one way or the other. It simply does not amount to a proposition that to say you don't agree with something can be interpreted as an agreement.
But what you're suggesting is that the provision for proposals to be laid in both houses of Parliament with a statement, and for Welsh Government's statement to also to be there as well. I think you're suggesting that is a significant strengthening of Sewell, or an additional element to Sewell that didn't exist before.
Yeah, no, I absolutely say that, and that was what I said to David Melding. But what I think Dr. Lloyd is doing is he's looking at the amendment, which describes a consent decision. And what that means is that a consent decision can be a decision to give consent, a decision not to give consent, or a decision not to lay a motion in front of an assembly or a parliament seeking consent one way or another. What you cannot do, I think it is a stretch beyond any reasonable interpretation, to say that that means that a decision not to give consent can be interpreted as giving consent.
Yeah, the emphasis being on decision rather than consent. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think this will be, I am hopeful that this will be made very clear by UK ministers when this is debated in the House of Lords on Wednesday.
Yes.
We'll await that clarification.
Mandy Jones, you've got some more questions.
Yes.
I haven't got through mine.
Oh, but I beg your pardon, Dave. I beg your pardon, sorry.
We may be able to rattle through some of these quite quickly.
Okay.
When a draft regulation is sent to you by the UK government that they want to lay before Parliament, and it requires our consent, the 40-day clock starts, but you're under no obligation to send it to us in that time frame as well. So, you know, why isn't there automatic requirement that you inform us immediately?
I assume, Chair, it is because drafters of the bill did not feel it was right to lay duties on Welsh ministers in that way. But you'll know that the letter that will come to Welsh ministers will go at the same day to the presiding officer. So the Parliament will be informed at the same timetable as us. And I'm quite happy, David, to give an undertaking
So
this
you accept
afternoon.
the principle must be observed.
That we would lay them immediately. We were able to.
And then, you know, famously, when things come out of the freezer, I don't think there's a decision yet that we get notified on that. You just get notified, or how does that operate?
Chair, I think the difference is that there is no consent arrangement for matters coming out of the freezer.
Right.
But given that we are very keen to get things out of the freezer, and the National Assembly's concern is that powers are temporarily being withheld from them, we didn't feel that it was necessary to hold up the process by the consent, because this is simply
and similarly,
doing...
just as your consent isn't required for things coming out of the freezer, because you don't envisage that there could be timing issues or could be inconvenient. You just think, well, if they're ready to come out, they should come out.
Yeah.
And there's no LCM requirement on the Assembly because the competence has only been is in abeyance from your point of view, then, rather than not existing and then being handed to.
Exactly that. And the anxieties amongst people who have reservations about the agreement are about powers being temporarily not available to the Assembly. So I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that the same and people with those anxieties will be anxious to have those powers back as soon as possible. and would not be looking for further institutional complexity in getting them back in the hands of the Assembly.
And then, when there is legislative activity in these frozen areas, the minute, as I understand it, it's the UK government consults the Welsh government, but there is no link that goes on then to us as the legislature. And why do you think that's appropriate? Because that doesn't seem to involve very much scrutiny from our point of view.
Chair, I think it's just important to be clear that no use can be made of those powers to change policy in any way. They are frozen on all sides. The only changes that UK ministers can make are technical changes, just to make sure that the law is able to operate effectively post-Brexit. So this is the business about, you know, if the statute relies on a named European Union body that is no longer part of the landscape here, that a different body would need to be named. But it can't change the policy in any way.
So they would be fairly administrative and minor.
Entirely. They are confined to technical corrections.
And will there be lots of them? You know, because we have to be careful of the technical word, and this applies not just to using the law, but you know, it applies to the regulations as well. So,
I think it is quite difficult to know how many technical corrections there may be. Work is going on those areas that would remain in the hands of the National Assembly from the outset, where corrections of that sort will be in the hands of the Assembly. So we're beginning to get an idea of how many they may be, but I don't think I'm in a position to make a sensible guess for you this afternoon.
And then my final question, with your indulgence, Chair, is Annex A, which is the list of policy areas that are likely, I think it's the phrasing, to be subject to Clause 11. And they're 24, and they're fairly extensive. You know, in a lot of areas, it seems to limit us more or less completely, whilst, you know, in agricultural, fisheries, environmental issues, some public procurement. And then we could well have food geographical indicators added. I mean, I think that's important, but perhaps, you know, not such an extensive issue in terms of, you know, a lot of the public are concerned. But state aid, which we don't know is in or out of the freezer at the moment, that seems a biggie. So, you know, how restricted is our power for policy making going to be?
Chair, I'm not allowed to ask members of the committee questions, but if even in a rhetorical way, I might put it like this. If the member suggests that having 24 areas retained in the freezer is very extensive, I wonder how he would describe twice that number coming directly to the National Assembly as a result of this agreement. Because in the original clause 11, all 64 areas would have been retained at Westminster. As a result of this agreement, 40 of those will now stay here from the very beginning. So twice as many areas as are in the freezer are being made available immediately to the Assembly. It would not have been. So 24 is extensive, then I think this agreement delivers twice that.
Okay, but I mean, at the very least, this is significant. These are significant areas of public policy, which means the frameworks, their construction and governance, are matters of huge public interest.
No, I know.
And what happens to state aid is doubly so in ways, surely.
Yes, Chair, I completely agree with that. State aid is there at the moment because it's still a matter of discussion between the governments, and in any case, as I know Mr Mellon will certainly be aware, the way state aids are treated post-Brexit, post the transition period, is itself a matter of very significant negotiations over the extent to which we will be able to have frictionless access to the single market. Because if we do think that we have extensive ability to depart from European Union existing rules in relation to state aid, then that will undoubtedly cause new restrictions on our ability to trade across the European Union, because they will expect us not to use state aids in a way that distorts the market. So the state aid issue is way beyond the narrow point that we are negotiating on here. And just finally to say that, again, as I know David will know, the fact that these areas are identified as being in the freezer does not mean at all that everything that lies under that heading is going to be retained there for legislative underpinning. In fact, in quite a number of areas, the bulk of what lies underneath that heading will very quickly be identified as material that can be negotiated in a non-legislative way. And we talked last weekend on the floor of the Assembly about having to work across the government and the legislature to devise scrutiny arrangements that will allow the Assembly to do the job it is here to do in seeing how that side of these things develop. So, you know, those things will come our way even faster.
Well, just very quickly, you've answered a number of questions on the sunset clauses. In terms of the frameworks generally, if Scotland doesn't give legislative consent, of course, it's very difficult for progress to be made. Is that correct?
Well, I don't think it is, Chair, necessarily, because the UK government has already said very explicitly that everything that we have agreed with them will be available to Scotland as well. So all the safeguards that we have agreed, all the need to secure consent, all of that will be available to the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, whether or not they give their consent. And although I have not read in the last few days what the Scottish Government has said, I do believe the Scottish ministers are previously on record as saying that, however this is finally resolved, they would still intend to play a full and constructive part in the ongoing discussions about frameworks and so on. So I remain hopeful that even if the Scottish Government does not feel able in the end to recommend legislative consent, that the framework we have established will be sufficient to allow them to go on playing the constructive part I believe they have played so far.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, I've just got a couple of final questions, if you're okay for just a few more minutes. Mandy Jones?
You've taken one of mine anyway. I am so glad that Wales and the UK government are going to be doing this, you know, on parity, and that makes life a whole lot easier for everybody. In last week's statement, you said we recommend that the Welsh Government enters into an intergovernment relationship agreement with this committee to support the scrutiny of Welsh Government activity in this area. Can you keep us informed on the Wales and the UK activities, please?
Yes, Chair, of course. I'm very happy to commit to continuing to report to this committee and to the EAAL committee on further developments in this field, and to repeat what I said last week about the Welsh Government's willingness to work with this committee where you think that would be useful in developing the arrangements that will be needed on the part of the legislature to oversee the actions that will flow from these agreements.
Okay, and one very final, very technical point. Paragraph 7 of the memorandum, clause 11 regulations will be made in accordance with the following processes. However, within the 6-step process which follows, step C says where draft regulations have been developed in line with this agreement. I mean, it implies that some might be made differently. I presume that's a drafting thing, but I wonder if you could clarify that. You don't have to deal with it now, but possibly by...
Well, Chair, I'll write to you, of course, if there's anything I need to add. But no, that wording is there, as I recall, at following representations made by the Welsh Government, because it goes on to say that we would not unreasonably refuse to recommend consent. And I was only willing to sign up to that where the process of developing frameworks had been delivered in the way that the agreement sets out. So I was not prepared to sign up to something that would bind me not unreasonably to recommend to the National Assembly the consent is given if I felt that the process of developing that framework had not been delivered faithfully in line with this
The
agreement.
sort of honour clause.
Yes,
Yeah,
I just wanted to be clear that I was not signing a blank cheque for anybody in saying that I would guarantee to come to the floor of the Assembly recommending consent if I felt that the process that had led to that point had in practice turned out to be flawed.
Well, Cabinet Secretary, we come to the end of time, and thank you very much. I think we've gone through all the questions and points that we wanted to raise. Obviously, we'll be giving consideration in due course to the LCM itself. Transcript of the evidence will, of course, be made available. And again, thank you for attending. I know you've had quite a number of sessions on this, and we seem to be moving on now. Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr.
Now move into private session. Now move into private session. Is that agreed? Thank you very much.